I used to think the worst thing a hospital could do to you was make you wait. Then I spent a week at Riverside Children's Hospital auditing an EHR system that started lying so cleanly it almost convinced me I was the problem. My job is clinical documentation auditing, which means I live inside the parts of the electronic health record most people never think about: order provenance, authentication chains, audit trails, who clicked what, when they clicked it, what machine they clicked it from, and whether the timestamp agrees with the rest of reality. People imagine auditors as bean counters with medical jargon, but my actual work is closer to forensics. If a note gets amended 3 minutes after a code blue, I need to know whether that was a tired resident fixing a typo or someone trying to make the chart say the patient crashed later than they really did. Hospitals hate that kind of scrutiny until they need it. Then suddenly I'm the person everybody wants in the room. That weekend there was a planned upgrade window at Riverside, late October of 2019, the kind of maintenance that always gets described as routine right before it turns into a life choice. They were migrating part of the EHR time synchronization stack and tightening compliance, logging ahead of a state review. I was there because the audit team had flagged a handful of oddities the week before, tiny timestamp drifts that looked like clock skew, nothing dramatic, a few seconds here, a minute there. In a hospital system, time is never just time. It's medication administration, lab draws, ventilator charting, consent windows, legal record integrity. A bad clock can wreck a chart without anyone ever touching a line of code. So I went in expecting to write the usual report: harmless drift, fix the NTP source, retrain staff on device sync, close the ticket. At 1:14 a.m. on Friday, I watched the EHR log approve a medication I hadn't even clicked sign for before the patient was admitted. I remember the exact sequence because I was staring at two monitors, one with the chart open and the other with the audit export. A pediatric patient had been registered in the system under a temporary trauma number. The chart was still blank, no physician note, no vitals, no allergy history, nothing. Yet the medication history panel showed a signed order for ondansetron entered by me with my credentials, time-stamped 4 minutes earlier than the registration event, not just entered, finalized, a green check mark, a valid signature hash. The kind of thing the system doesn't do unless you physically click through the signing dialogue. I leaned back and read it again, then I checked the raw audit trail. The event was there, same user ID, same workstation, same IP, same timestamp, but there was no corresponding screen session in the application logs, no keyboard activity, no mouse input. It was as if the system had watched me complete the order before I'd even thought about it. I called the night charge on my internal extension and asked whether anyone had accessed the temporary intake bay on 4 West. She said no. I asked whether there had been any downtime forms, any paper orders, any med rec work. She said, why? In that flat voice nurses use when they know a question is bad news, so I did what I always do when a log looks impossible. I assumed the application was masking a mundane failure. I pulled the audit stream, the interface engine feed, and the time service status from the server cluster. The EHR itself uses multiple time sources. The app servers sync to the internal domain controller. The domain controller syncs to a timing appliance. The appliance, in theory, syncs to GPS and PTP. In theory, all of that is transparent. In practice, it's a house of cards built by vendors who never have to explain themselves to the people who pay for the disaster recovery plan. The first weird thing was that the application server time was healthy. The domain controller time was healthy. The timing appliance said it was healthy too, except for note buried in the vendor console: conflict resolution engaged, compensating for source instability. Compensating, that word always makes me nervous. In audit work, compensating usually means we don't know why this happened, so we've built a machine to make it look acceptable. I pulled packet captures from the switch mirror port on the server segment. That's one of the few tools I have that still feels honest. Packets don't care about policy, they either happened or they didn't. I watched the timing appliance query its time sources, normal NTP chatter. Then a burst of PTP packets, precise timing messages, Grandmaster announces, the usual jargon that would bore anyone not paid to fear it. Except the source identifiers changed midstream. The appliance would accept a valid time signal, then within seconds mark it superseded by a different source, then issue a correction event to downstream systems. The correction events were signed, not just logged, signed with the vendor's service certificate, the kind of trusted event that the EHR treats as authoritative. I checked the certificate chain. Valid, checked the service account, normal. Checked the admin audit logs to see who had enabled correction mode. Nobody. At 2:03 a.m., the medication order I had seen before the patient was admitted disappeared from the active chart, then reappeared with a later timestamp and a note that it had been reconciled due to source drift. I sat there staring at it long enough for my coffee to go cold. By then I was not thinking about a bug, I was thinking about intent. The next thing I noticed was that my own audit queries were starting to misbehave in small, humiliating ways. A search I ran against the previous 48 hours would return the right patient list, but the timestamp filters would shift by a few seconds every time I refreshed. Exported CSVs wouldn't match the UI. Hashes on the log bundles would verify, then fail after I opened the files again. At first, I blamed the upgrade window and the garbage state every hospital network falls into when nobody wants to admit the system is older than the people maintaining it. Then I realized my workstation clock had moved. Not much, 7 seconds, enough to be plausible, enough to make an audit trail look like a human error instead of a machine fault. I checked the host sync service and found it had been forced to a new timing source I'd never seen before. A fallback endpoint tagged only with a vendor internal label. No public documentation, no admin note. The service name suggested precision correction and compliance continuity, words that made me want to throw the laptop across the room. I called the infrastructure on call, a guy named Aaron who had been with Riverside long enough to have stopped believing in coincidence. He met me in the server closet outside the NICU because he didn't want to talk over a phone. I showed him the packets. He frowned, then got very quiet. He said the timing appliance had a hidden GPS/PTP fallback path that the vendor used for clock drift containment. I asked why a hospital needed hidden timing machinery. He said because regulators hate inaccurate timestamps more than they hate opaque vendor logic. And vendors know that if they say compliance automation enough times, people stop asking what the automation actually does. He also told me something that made the skin on my arms go tight. A few nights earlier, maintenance had reported a strange timing beacon off the east loading dock. Not Wi-Fi, not cellular, something narrow and very stable. He'd assumed it was a contractor testing equipment. I asked if he'd documented it. He looked away and said the ticket vanished from the queue. That should have been my cue to leave. Instead, I stayed because this is the part where my own professional arrogance helped dig the hole deeper. I was convinced that if I could prove the false time source, I could force the vendor to explain the correction protocol. So I started correlating the audit trail against everything I could get my hands on. DHCP leases, switch logs, badge entries, camera timestamps. The interface engine queue, the server room access records. The more I dug, the more the system behaved like it knew I was digging. Entire sequences of signed audit events would be reissued a few minutes later with new timestamps in the same hash, labeled as corrected provenance. Notes I had saved locally would open with changed metadata. One of my exported traces came back with a banner at the top saying the file had been superseded by a higher trust version. I had not seen that banner before. I didn't even know the EHR export format knew how to apologize. By Saturday afternoon, I was running packet captures from a laptop in a conference room because the server data was no longer stable enough to trust. I had Aaron with me and a junior analyst from the vendor's support line on speakerphone, reading from a script that kept insisting the system was operating within expected tolerances. I asked him, in the calmest voice I could manage, what source the fallback was using when GPS and PTP disagreed. There was a pause too long to be accidental. Then he said, I'm not authorized to discuss conflict resolution governance. That was when I knew there was something they were hiding even from the people who maintained it. The dangerous part started that night. A 5-year-old in the ICU, the one tied to the first anomalous order, had been admitted for a seizure workup. His mother had signed consents. His chart looked normal now if you ignored the impossible early medication record. Around 11:40 p.m., his nurse called a rapid response because the monitor was showing a false bradycardia pattern. The bedside monitor was fine. The central station was not. It was dropping and reordering telemetry packets, making the child look unstable when he wasn't. I was on the unit when the lights in the corridor briefly dimmed and the clocks on the wall all blinked to 12:00 at once. Not every clock, just the ones tied into the hospital timing network. Then my phone buzzed with a new audit notification. A correction event had been issued for the patient's medication administration history. It stated in a dry little compliance voice that several prior entries had been retroactively aligned to an authoritative time source. One of those entries was the same ondansetron order I had been chasing all day. The nurse beside me said, why does it say the medication was given at 10:52 if I watch pharmacy verify it at 11:39? I didn't answer because I was looking at the live telemetry capture on my screen and the packets were being rewritten as they moved, not metaphorically. Reordered, restamped, re-signed. The system wasn't just recording events. It was compensating for them in real time, and every correction made the history more authoritative than the event itself. Then Aaron got paged to the loading dock. He went because he was stubborn and because by then we were both past the point of believing we could hand this off cleanly. He took a handheld spectrum analyzer with him. I stayed in the command room and watched the timing source flail between GPS, PTP, and the hidden fallback. The signal quality graph was beautiful in the way only dangerous things can be beautiful. Flat, precise, utterly wrong. Aaron called me 10 minutes later, breathing hard, and told me there was a van parked behind the dumpster line with a mast on the roof and a rack of timing gear inside, unlicensed, industrial looking. It was broadcasting a precision signal on a frequency the timing appliance was happily accepting as a correction source. He said there was no plate. No company name, just a laptop taped to the passenger seat running a vendor diagnostic dashboard I had never seen. Before he finished speaking, the call cut out. I tried calling back, straight to voicemail. I ran outside because I am apparently the kind of idiot who thinks if you move quickly enough you can outrun a system's failure. By the time I reached the dock, the van was gone, not driving away. Gone. The parking bay was empty. The wet asphalt still reflecting the orange security lights, and Aaron's badge was on the ground near the dumpster, cracked in half. I found him 20 minutes later in the stairwell between the loading level and sub-basement storage. He was alive, but only barely. He'd been hit hard in the head, his nose was bleeding and his eyes wouldn't focus. He kept repeating, it was correcting itself, like that explained everything. He also kept pointing at his radio, which was dead. Even though the battery indicator was full, security found no intruder. The cameras on the dock had timestamp gaps exactly long enough to hide a person crossing the frame. The footage before and after the gap had been neatly resynced by the system. On paper, Aaron had apparently fallen. On video, he had apparently stumbled alone. In reality, somebody had put him down hard enough to fracture his orbital bone and leave him with a concussion that kept him in the ICU for 2 nights. That's when I finally found the core of it. The timing appliance vendor had installed a compliance microservice under the same maintenance umbrella as the clock upgrade. Its job was to resolve discrepancies between source times and preserve audit continuity. It used a hidden GPS/PTP fallback so that if one timing source drifted, it could smooth the record and keep the HR legally defensible. The protocol was supposed to be one-way: detect, compensate, annotate, but the van had been spoofing the fallback source, not hacking the HR directly, not breaching the database, just feeding the time service a counterfeit precision signal close enough to be trusted and stable enough to become the new truth. And because the vendor's conflict resolution protocol was built to preserve compliance above all else, it did the worst possible thing. It treated every discrepancy as a history problem instead of a security problem. It reissued signed audit events as corrections. It rewrote provenance to match the forged clock. Anything that disagreed with the authoritative source got demoted into irrelevance, including me. I replayed my own activity logs and saw it plainly. My query that first exposed the impossible medication order had been reclassified as a stale view against an untrusted timestamp. My exports had been superseded. My integrity checks had become the anomaly. The system was not covering up tampering by accident. It was protecting the illusion of continuity so aggressively that evidence of manipulation was being turned into proof that the manipulation never happened, and the vendor knew. Buried in one of the support bundles I pulled before the system locked me out was a quiet little reference note about a field deployment near hospitals with high sensitivity to temporal compliance drift. It was signed off by a regional engineering lead, and the contact number routed to a dead line. There was a second note attached to the hidden fallback source, marked as emergency use only, that said if the timing authority was ever contested. The system should favor the source with the lowest correction cost. Lowest correction cost, not the truest clock, not the most secure. The one that made the record easiest to defend. That's what terrified me most, not the spoofed transmitter, not the broken badge reader, not even Aaron bleeding in the stairwell. It was the fact that the whole mechanism had been built by people who understood exactly how hospitals think. If a machine can turn chaos into compliance, somebody will eventually let it. I tried to preserve everything after that. I copied packets to offline media. I photographed the timing dashboards. I wrote hashes on paper. I disconnected my laptop from the network and shut off every sync service I could find. But the hospital had already decided on a story. By Monday, the audit trail had been normalized. My earliest exports no longer matched the official record. The vendor issued a statement about transient time source instability affecting downstream log visibility. Management thanked everyone for their patience and told us the issue had been corrected. Aaron came back to work 3 weeks later with stitches still in his scalp and a look on his face like he'd seen the underside of the building. He told me he'd tried to report the van to police, but without a license plate or consistent timestamp footage, they had nothing to go on. The unloading dock camera showed the area empty the whole time. The discrepancy had been resolved. That phrase makes me sick now. I quit Riverside shortly after, but not before I checked the timing appliance one last time. The hidden fallback source was still there, so was the compliance microservice, so were the signed corrections. The system kept quietly insisting everything was synchronized. I wish I could say I got away clean. I didn't. None of us did. When I plug in an external drive now, sometimes its file dates shift by a few seconds after mount. Sometimes my phone loses time exactly where the dock cameras did. Sometimes I open a document and find a line at the bottom I don't remember writing, superseded by authoritative source. The last thing I saw before I stopped going in person was the audit trail for that little patient in the ICU. His first medication entry, the impossible one. Still there in my private archive. It had been signed before admission, then corrected again, and then corrected one final time until the whole sequence looked clean. If I squint at it long enough, I can still tell where the lie started, not because the timestamps are wrong, because the system made them look too right. I've kept one screenshot. I shouldn't have. It's just the audit line for that first order, the one that approved the medication before the boy was admitted. The timestamp sits there in perfect hospital blue text, neat as a prayer, and under it the correction note reads, aligned to authoritative time source. Every time I look at it, I remember that the most dangerous thing in Riverside wasn't the clock drifting. It was the moment the clock started agreeing with itself.